It's Kat again, back at it with another lecture, and today we're going to be talking about UI and UX design, or more colloquially called, how to make your game look better. Oh. Have you ever played a game or used something that was so frustrating you instantly rage quit and never touched it again? Like the raging little animal on the right hand side? Because I sure have. No matter how good your game is, a shitty UI UX will make no one want to play it. Even with low quality graphics, good UI and UX will actually bring people in. It's a very underrated way to drastically increase the appeal of your game. So overview. In this lecture, I'm going to be going over what a UI is, the 4 classes of it, UI factors, and how to make it look good, as well as a brief overview of UX. So, UI, or user interface, all about UI and design. What is UI? UI is user interface, or anything the player interacts with. It mainly covers the graphical layout of the game, but it muddies with general game design, which includes the visual elements, anything the player interacts with, and animation. There are 4 classes of UI that can be seen in the image here. It includes non-diegetic, spatial, meta, and diegetic. Non-diegetic components are components that are not actually in the game story or the game space, and characters in the game are not aware of these components. In fast-paced games, bad placement of non-diegetic components may interrupt the player's sense of immersion. In strategy games, it gives players better assessment of their situation and resources. Some examples of these components include stat meters, such as a health bar, small level maps, and a ring menu, as you can see here. For instance, this league minimap, this health bar, or this ring menu. Diegetic components are components that exist in the game story and in the game space. Characters in-game are aware of this component. As well, you must keep in mind scale. You have to make it visible to players and readable without completely interfering with the game. Some examples of these components include futuristic overlays in games like, for instance, Warframe, or gadgets the player holds up, or physical limitations that happens to the player during the game, like for instance in Dead by Daylight where you crawl after taking damage. And some instances can be seen here where this player is now hunched over with limited movement because they're bleeding, or in this image here where you can see that the player is holding up a map and an actual GPS gadget, but they're actual in-game things. Or in the right-hand side image, which is the Warframe menu, which pops up in the game itself. Spatial components are components not in the game story, but that do exist in the game space. They're generally visual aids that help the player select objects or indicates important aspects of the game. For instance, text labels, racing lines, and selection auras. In these images here, you can see in the upper left-hand corner, this is a screen grab from Madden, how these little blue circles here are spatial indicators. They don't actually affect anything in the game, but they do help players understand what areas are on the map and stuff. And in the lower right-hand corner, you can see a screen grab from Overwatch, which has this blue outline, which indicates the payload area that the players are supposed to capture. It does kind of involve the game, but it's mainly a visual indicator for players to know where to be. Meta components are components that exist in the game story, but not in the game space. They usually indicate damage to a player. And some examples of this component include screen shake, the screen tinting red, and scrolling dialogue. So here you can see in the lower left-hand corner, you can see the screen kind of shake once the player takes damage. And in the right-hand screen grab, you can see the player's screen is kind of tinted red from bleeding. Boop. And UI factors include ambience, sensibility, and simplicity. So ambience is the audio-visual theme of the game. Just from glancing at the game's UI, Players should be able to tell the genre and what to expect from your game. For instance, if you look at these bottom two images here, the left-hand image, even if you don't know what game it is, you can kind of take a look at some of the UI components here and see that it's kind of a futuristic sci-fi game. Whereas if you look at the right-hand game, looking at these components here, you can see that it's more of like a cutesy, fun type game. And for reference, it's Warframe and Overcooked. Having a strong design language, which is the uniform rule to make every part of your game stand out, is really important in game design and in UI design because it sets the ambience of your game. Sensibility. Players should be able to naturally navigate your game with little to no reliance on outside guides. In short, things should literally make sense. For example, I would pull an example of Stardew Valley versus Minecraft and the trading system. In Minecraft, you can easily just drop like 99 wood and someone else could pick it up. However, in Stardew Valley, that's not very practical because the moment you drop something, it pretty much like instantly gets sucked up back to your character. And you can't actually physically give someone like 99 wood. You actually have to place it in a chest for the other player to then grab, which in my opinion is a pretty bad design. It's kind of impractical and it just makes things more tedious. So in general, when you're designing your game, it should just be very sensible and things should make sense. It sounds like common sense, but sometimes when you're creating your game, you assume players know how things work when they might not actually. Elements in your game should respond immediately. Delays and lags or wait time disrupts a player's immersion and ruins the overall gameplay. Going back to the Stardew Valley and Minecraft example, for instance in trading again, the having to put your logs in a chest before the other player can take it out is a kind of delay in gameplay. It adds extra time to the game that really isn't necessary. So in general, it's best to omit these kind of problems. Simplicity. Reduce cognitive load and confusion. The simplest things are generally the ones that make the most sense. So again, going back to sensibility, try to keep things simple. If you're adding UI elements to your game, you should heavily consider whether the elements actually benefit or will add things to your game before you actually implement it. You don't want to add extra cognitive load and just clutter to your game. And lastly, the game design in general and your UI should be easy to learn and difficult to master. You don't want your UI to hinder the game learning experience by just being too complicated. Again, it's Dorth something, this game, but the design in general is just so bad. It's nice they have an example over here as to like what each like letter is, but the UI layout is just so cluttered and so confusing, and the game in general is just very complicated. Try to avoid something like that. Here is a link to a game that I think is very helpful for UI. It is based on mobile app design rather than games, but it does go over very general and, in my opinion, very important to know UI concepts. It's very quick and simple to play, but you can really see how very small changes can actually greatly affect the UI. So, how to make a nice UI? Well, we're gonna get right into that. First, have fast engagement. People have short attention spans, so engage them quickly. Next, simple is best. Again, like I've mentioned before, consider every UI element you add. Make sure it's necessary before you add it. You don't want to have a game screen that's like cluttered with like this and that, everything is all over the screen, because then you're only just confusing the player and it's not adding to the gameplay experience. You want to reduce cognitive load of the player. Blend the tutorial into the game. No one likes playing a 20-minute tutorial that they have to get through before they can actually play the game. We all just want to get to playing and get to having fun. And again, I don't know about you, but I just personally skip all of the campaign modes too, because I think it's pretty boring. I just want to play the game. So yeah, just let them play the game and build a tutorial that lets people learn alongside playing the game. Theme your UI. Make sure the UI theme fits well with the genre of your game. And in terms of design, the color palette should match as well. If you look at the screen grab here of a UI sample plate, you can see that it's for a game called Dungeon Hunter 4. I personally don't know what this game is, but you can pretty much infer from the name that it's gonna be some sort of like dungeon exploration, like fighting type game. So you can see that the UI is themed to match. This element here has a skull and weapons, and in general, all of the UI elements are surrounded with a sort of like rustic stone type layout, which matches the game theme pretty well. Guide the player's eyes. Use design concepts to guide people to where to look. I mentioned this previously in a different lecture, but again, people tend to look at bold things first and very small and hard to see things last. So in terms of formatting your UI, you want all of the important stuff to be large and bold, and all of the less important stuff to be very small. You can see in the second line of this slide how your eyes are instantly drawn to the text that is in bold, and you read the text small last just because it's physically smaller and harder to see than the other text. So again, make less important text smaller and vice versa. Next, easy controls. The controls in your game should be easy to learn and it should make sense. WASD, if it's like adventure type game, should be for move or the arrow keys. Generally, the spacebar is for jump. And again, for controls, it should be easy to access within the game. You shouldn't have to like go through, jump through all these like loops and hurdles just if you want to like access the controls and possibly rebind it. Make sure it makes sense. Leverage familiarity. People make assumptions. So therefore, you can use assumptions to your benefit. People generally assume, for instance, that the health bar is green, the space bar is for jump, and the back button will be in settings. Or, as another example, the save button will be in settings, right? So if you're trying to save the game, you would expect to look in settings to find the save button, or possibly a save checkpoint. You wouldn't expect to possibly, like, I don't know, have to go, like, swim under this water and, like, find a chest and that's where the save button's gonna be. No one's gonna figure that out. And if your game is designed that way, it's probably gonna be too complicated. So familiarity within games can actually be leveraged to make your game easier to understand and play. But also, don't really go against the grain and add weird elements to your game. And lastly, be consistent. The UI in your game should be consistent throughout, as well as your game and your art. It should have the same font, color palette, and theme. You can look at the screen grab here on the right hand side, and again, I can't read Arabic, but you can pretty much tell that all of these three screen grabs belong to the same game because all of the UI and everything is themed the same. And again, like I've mentioned previously, you want the UI theme to match your game. You don't want to have like really cutesy looking UI for a sci-fi game. It just wouldn't make sense. Next, UX, which stands for user experience. There are 4 stages of UX. Discovery, which is learning the expectations of those who play your game. Exploration, or understanding the scope of your design. Testing, which is implementing the designs of your games that you think players would enjoy, while making sure it works properly. And lastly, listening, and learning about what bugs or issues are in your game. But wait, we've already done that. We've already gone through 2 entire playtests, which you guys have either received or will receive the playtest feedback for. There's also one more playtest coming up. Please take the playtest feedback responses into mind when you're building your game. If people mention bugs or things like that, then you should probably go fix it. And again, user feedback is a great way to get understanding of your game without you actually without the bias of being the developers yourself. Because again, as the developer, you have like preconceived biases and you think certain things will be certain ways or players will perceive it one way, but maybe players actually perceive it a different way. And so playtests are a great way to get feedback for that. And because you guys have one more playtest coming up, this is the perfect opportunity to get the last remaining feedback you need. It's a great chance to think about what extra last bit of questions that you want to go ask players before you finally release your final project. And lastly, be impartial. I know this is your game and this is your baby, and I'm sure that you have a perfect vision in your head of how you'd like your game to be. However, what you visualize and what people enjoy playing may be two different things. You might really like difficult and challenging games with a really hard boss battle, and you get one shot like 50 times, but you have to overcome the tribulations to beat the game. But maybe not everyone likes playing that. And so the user feedback is a great way to get responses as to how people perceive and enjoy your game. And again, be impartial in implementation. No one is trying to like be really harsh and bite you about this stuff. It's all for just general improvement. And yeah, now going on to Weylan's for implementation of UI.
Hey everybody, for the next few minutes I'll be going over some implementation details. So, throughout my time doing game development in Unity, I've had the misfortune of having to do UI for a lot of games. Personally, I think Unity UI is kind of a mess. You have UI scaling issues, anchor presets, resolution settings, all of which are all over the place and sometimes pretty difficult to find. Implementing UI can be really daunting, but hopefully with the next few series of tips, I can make your life a little bit easier. Alright, so right off the bat, if you want to set your game's screen size or resolution, here's the place to do it. Inside of Unity, you'll want to go to Edit, head down to the Project Settings, and then scroll down to the Player Resolution and Presentation area. There, you'll see the resolution and presentation settings. Be careful with full screen. Screens might not all have the same resolution even at full screen, so you'll want to account for that later on. Now I know in class we joke a lot about how having a split scene and game layout is really amazing, but this is one of the actual reasons why. Being able to adjust your UI in the scene editor and then getting instant feedback from your game view is extremely valuable. In order to set this up, you'll just want to go over to the top right corner of your Unity editor and hit layout, and then just fiddle around until you find one that works for you that has this sort of split scene and game layout. Next, I'm going to be brushing over anchors. Anchors are one of those things that can make you tear your hair out, or make it so that you have almost no positional errors and a really easy time with your UI. The UI anchors are what hold and position your UI elements. The anchors and the rect transform component are going to be some of the most important parts in making sure your UI behaves the way you want it to. Alright, so first things first, I don't want to get too detailed into this, but one mistake a lot of people make is not realizing that position is relative to your anchor. In the left picture, you can see that the anchor is in the middle of the screen. The X is at -126, and the Y is at 97, and these are relative to the center of the screen. That means that no matter how big or small your screen is, your object will always be that distance away from your anchor point. Because of this, there's one more thing I do need to mention. The position that your UI element is in is fixed. So, if your screen shrinks, your UI element might not be lined up where you think it's going to be, relative to everything else on the screen. Or, if your UI element is on the edge of the screen, it might disappear altogether. Next, we'll talk about presets. If you click on the anchor presets, you'll see a bunch of options appear. The presets allow you to anchor to the middle of the 4 edges as well as the 4 corners of the screen. Stretch is one way that allows your UI elements to shrink or stretch if the screen changes in size. This is a quick and easy tool if you're okay with just using the basic presets provided to you. Another way of making sure that your UI maintains its shape is to use the Preserve Aspect button. Note that this is only really for UI images. With other items, you're going to have to fiddle around with the anchors a little more. Take extra care with sliders because if your screen shrinks too much, they'll disappear altogether. UI text can also wrap around or disappear if you don't anchor correctly, so make sure you be careful when you do anchor. The last thing I want to make you aware of is the canvas scaler. If you don't want to mess with any of the previous things, one easy setting you can change is the canvas scaler. Simply change your canvas scaler to become the scale with screen size option, and that should solve a lot of your simple basic scaling issues. Alright, In summary, you can use anchors to position and stretch and shrink. Your images can be set to preserve aspect, and your entire canvas can be set to stretch with screen size. By no means is this the entire suite of things you can do with Unity. UI is really complicated and messy, but hopefully if you're trying to just place some menu buttons or have some health bars, then these tips will be really helpful for you. Thank you guys for watching. I'll catch you guys next time.